And thank you for listening to Nuance, a current events podcast from me, Roberto Alejandro, journalist and founder of OnBackground.com, and my co-host, police scientist Mike Wood. And today we're discussing one of the proposed solutions endorsed by Campaign Zero, a grassroots response to the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement to reform policing in America. And the solution that we're going to be discussing is training. Now, Mike, you have some very, I'll say, non-traditional opinions about the role and impact of training in policing. So I'll let you take it from here.
Well, let's start off with my dream of policing is really a federal police force that has master levels or above education who are distributed out to the cities and are well incentivized and done. So, I mean, understand, I do want the education and the training, but in this current environment, when we're talking about reform, I just find that the training isn't quite inadequate as we think it is.
Okay.
We have things like, so they do a lot of implicit bias training now. And implicit bias is really probably our main issue when it comes to individuals recognizing as they are police officers why they are acting in certain ways towards other people. If you don't understand implicit bias, well, then you're not going to understand that human beings can do things for motivations that they're not calculating. And we do training now, and I'd like to use implicit bias because they did it in Baltimore. And when they did it here, there's a newspaper article that people can look up in the Sun. And I like to point it out that what happened is the officers learned about implicit bias training, and then they left and they said, oh, we need to treat white people just as bad as we do black people because they're just as dangerous. And it's like, no, because that's the thing is there's also implicit bias in all of our systems and structures. So if we can sit here and teach a young cop to understand implicit bias within himself, I always come back to, I get concerned that they can't see that within the system, and then they act within the system because the system's metrics and incentives are what guide human behavior. And so I don't necessarily want to get too focused on the training issues as being like a main problem, because if we use the training that we do now and we weren't fighting the drug war and we weren't treating people as the enemy, we weren't occupying geography, then we wouldn't be in these kind of exchanges where you're saying we need a guy that can shoot a gun out of a guy's hand from 20 yards away and carefully recognize the civilians around him and like all this other stuff that you think. It's just really unrealistic to think that there's even that many people on this planet that are able to be cool under fire and process these kind of situations when the shit gets thick.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest, right? Like the whole like opening scene in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid with Robert Redford shooting the guy's gun first off his waist and then across the floor of the, like that's not even remotely realistic in terms of how someone might operate in a conflict, right? And that's something that we don't appreciate, in part because so much of our media presents a very different picture of what policing looks like in intense situations, right? Like our social imaginary is like more informed by Die Hard, right, than the realities of the field. But let me ask, because certainly a lot of times when you have what are racist actions by the police, the response from police officials and politicians is often to say, we need more training. We're going to implement new training. And that's always sort of said in an attempt to sort of, I think, appease the community. But in terms of the focus of Campaign Zero with this specific proposed solution, do you feel like this is an instance in which the grassroots community here has maybe adopted one of the talking points from the official response, but one that is actually more of a red herring than as you have suggested?
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. And I really would like to suggest that all of these reforms are red herrings that are distractions. If the police chiefs have been telling you for the last 200 years, we're going to do training changes, and you keep being in these same situations, well, then these training changes aren't your issue. And how are you going to train like entire nations on this one little training issue that you have? I mean, is it really even a good idea of spending your money when you're in a podunk town in Iowa? Like, do you even really need cops? Like, I mean, how many interactions do people actually get into? I mean, one of the reasons why gun crime is higher in cities is because it's the level of human interactions.
Sure, yeah.
So if I walked around armed trying to shoot people in Podunk, Iowa, well, guess what? I'm not going to find a lot of people. But if I do it in Chicago, it's real easy to see.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we get caught up in these excuses, right? These placations where it's like, oh, this is what we're fixing. This is my Band-Aid that I can apply to it at this moment. You guys will say, oh, no, that's great. Kevin Davis is improving training. Like, well, what was wrong with the training and how are they even improving it? So if you send them to implicit bias and they come out saying, damn, you're right, we need to shoot white people more, what did you achieve?
Yeah. I mean, my concern with the sort of training argument, when our leaders make it, oh, we're going to implement new training, is it always first raises the question in my mind, like let's take Philando Castile. If the response after the death of Philando Castile is we're going to better train our police officers, the first question I have in my mind is, well, what did the training look like before? Because, this seems like something that just shouldn't be possible to happen in the first place, right? And so it does always feel like that training carrot is what they throw out, because they can always throw it out. You can always say, we're going to do training on that. We're going to do training on that. We're going to do training on that. And it just seems like these behaviors continue and these problems continue. But I'm curious, obviously, as someone who is a former police officer and a police sergeant, what would you say was the impact of the training on you when you first entered the police department, right? Which obviously would have been the youngest point in your police career. When you entered at that point where you're maybe not as worldly and you haven't seen everything you will eventually have come to see as a police officer on the streets, do you think that there is anything about the training that nonetheless could make an impact here? Do you think this is really completely 100%?
I feel like you just kind of defeated part of my argument when you made me think of something, and that was, you were talking about Philando Castile and car stops. And car stops are one of those things in training that sets a negative scene. The idea in car stop training is that all these situations are so dangerous. There's liable to be a gun and your life is at risk at every car stop. There's no such thing as a routine car stop. And we do practice scenarios with car stops, and it always involves like whether the guy has a gun and is going to kill you or not. But the odds of somebody having a gun and trying to attack a police officer during a car stop are statistically irrelevant. It's out of the amount of car stops you do, the idea that you're going to have a problem from this one individual driver is astronomically rare. So we go in with the mindset that the outlier is the common.
Absolutely. I mean, especially with car stops, would you say most car stops are related to traffic violations, or is it hard to quantify like how many might be that versus some other behavior you observed in the street?
Well, I mean, it is for state troopers who are monitoring highways.
Of course,
I believe when they say, hey, look, I don't know who was driving the damn car, I pretty much believe them. They're on a highway, it's too fast, you don't know what's going on, and so they'll do that. But if you're in a city or an area where you're heavily involved in the drug enforcement, well, then you know what happens.
No, yeah. I mean, the reason I asked is it would seem odd to me, but, this might apply to state troopers nonetheless, where obviously half the time, or say 75% of the time that you're pulling somebody over is because they were going 5-10 miles over the speed limit, that you're then trained to think first about whether or not this person is armed, right? Because you didn't stop them for anything related to seeing a gun.
It's weird, right?
It's like, but you're going to approach the car with like, he could have a gun. He drove 10 miles over the speed limit. He might be armed. I mean, so is it fair to say then that there's, I remember interviewing Kevin Davis, Police Commissioner Kevin Davis here in Baltimore City once, and he said, we have to do a better job of preparing police for what is probable versus for what is possible, right? In the American context, because of our Second Amendment, yeah, it's possible a driver has a gun. But what is probable is that this person was just trying to get home faster than they otherwise would have, right? Or, whatever the scenario is. Is that something that training can help in, or no?
I think it can, and that's what I was kind of backtracking on there a moment, was I realized that maybe it's not, like, the training they have that's good is good, but there is bad training that really sets the wrong scene, and that's a good example of it. I don't take anything Kevin Davis says for anything, because it's all rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, I at this point, I don't really go out of my way to try to interview folks like this, because at the end of the day, they're like lying to your face. And then you go and report it, which means now I'm lying to my audience's face. And it's like, do I really want to repeat this guy's lies, or do I want to let people read those lies in the sun? You know, like
totally understand.
I'm good, man. I don't need to sit here and have you lie to me, and I know it, and then I'm like, hey guys, this is what he had to say.
But the one thing we kind of looked a little bit more into the training and the way Campaign Zero was looking at it, and they're talking about appropriate engagement with youth and LGBTQ culture. I don't even know what the hell word I want to use for that, but everybody knows what I mean. And I really think that is a part of it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be training. My idea is integrate, not occupy. That's what I like to say all the time. So like all this training stuff gets complicated. And so you're talking about a 20-year-old, 21-year-old male, female that's coming out of college or their first couple jobs. They really don't know life yet. They have these issues in them. And it's like, it's not like we're going to get GEDs, no offense to them, but put them into a classroom where they're going to understand complex psychology. That's why I'm like, I don't, like, we're trying, how can we train our cops to be psychologists? Oh, come on, we can't. Move on from that. But so those biases that I keep talking about, that they're talking about when you integrate. So if you take these cops during their training period, and you make them go into environments like I did in the rec center that I had to volunteer for reimbursement. That really affected me being around those kids, because I realized quickly that if 5 years from then, if that kid was sitting on the corner slinging drugs, I would approach him way differently than I approached everybody else. And if another cop approached him aggressively, I would stand up and be like, whoa, what are you doing? I know this kid. So I really think those things are what we have to do, and they don't have to understand that. The cop doesn't have to understand. He just has to actually get into the community, know the communities. And while a lot of occupying police are in the communities every day, they literally know no one and don't know anything about the neighborhoods. I was that way. I didn't know anybody because I was looking to my next arrest.
And so to that extent, is it maybe less a question of the way you're trained to handle specific scenarios, like whether it's car stops or whether it's foot chase, whatever, and more about the way police training contributes to a particular culture of policing, right? It is maybe the issue not so much making sure they have all this information about implicit bias and all this other stuff, but to at least make sure that the way we're trained doesn't inform a sort of us versus them mentality, or even just a predominantly tactical one.
I feel like you're kind of synthesizing maybe what I'm trying to get to in my own mind, is that it's when I say I don't care about the training, it's because I don't need to train somebody to not put a bullet in somebody for no reason. It's these other things in life that have gotten that person to do that. So if we just get them in it, like, I know we have this idea that, say a cop is going to a situation, we have in our society's mind that the cop must win this situation, because if the cop doesn't win the situation, then somehow that's a breakdown of our entire society. And we're like, oh no, the bad guys can win. But here's the rule. Like, hey, the bad guys can win from time to time. The world will not fall apart. I promise you. I had it happen plenty of times. I remember, like, specifically chasing a guy into a dark alley. When he had a gun on him, he went down the dark alley, and my mind went, turn around and go. He wins.
He wins, yeah.
So that's okay. If we just don't solve everything with violence and process things in a human nature, I don't know that we really need to understand the psychology of how to treat people with empathy if you just put them in situations where they have to express empathy and actually do it physically.
Particularly in light of the fact that you were a police officer here in Baltimore, and Baltimore is definitely one of these American cities that really is struggling with issues like violence. Do you feel like there is a way to train police officers in urban environments that de-emphasizes some of the tactical issues that seem to lead to some of the mentalities that then end up getting people shot for no reason?
Yeah, I keep coming back to integrate, not occupy. I really think that if you just get people into these communities to see what they are, because they're not dangerous. They're not these evil people that came from some other dimension and have different goals in life. They all have the same goals as you. They wanted to see. They love their families. They want a nice house in a nice place. They want all the same things that you do. And when you realize they're not of them, they are in us, things just flow naturally. Like, I don't know, like, we as a society think that people are inherently bad. It's just like it's another one of those things. It's empirically false. Obviously, people are inherently good. We wouldn't have gotten this far.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely. To your mind, let me just finish with this question. How much of the us versus them in policing is a function of the training or the culture of policing, and how much of it is it just this, this tendency to think of the other?
It's a lot of other. Growing up in rural Maryland and Pennsylvania, I heard family and friends and people that I live around think about Baltimore police as the zookeepers. Like, they actually feel like the cops go to Baltimore to keep all the problems there so they don't escape out into the counties. And it's like, that's the kind of cultural zeitgeist.
They're kind of right, though.
Well, in the actual structure of what's going on, yes.
Yeah, I mean, both in the sense that it's not uncommon to hear persons from over-policed communities say they feel like they're occupied. But when you think about how much people's movements seem to be controlled through practices like stop and frisk and things like this, it does feel like
it's
the
not
purpose
a
of police, right?
It's not a feeling. I mean, there was a guy on the Department of Justice report that was stopped 30 times. And I'd like to remind everybody that we only document about 10% of our time. So he was stopped at least 300 times with nothing on him. So that is an occupation. That is a force that's violating your civil rights every single day. So, of course, you are being occupied. And I think if we see that guy as our uncle or our cousin, then there's just no way that we approach it that way. I mean, that's why I was in a rich white neighborhood when I was a cop for a hot minute. And while I was there, in my mind, the idea that I could make an arrest in this neighborhood didn't even process or make sense to me. It was like, why the hell am I here? Can I go somewhere where something is going on? Yeah. And that is false. There's a lot going on there. There are just as many drugs and drug dealers, if not more, in that rich white neighborhood than there is in that poor black neighborhood. But whether it's the culture, and the culture forms the systems, and the systems form the biases, it all ties in together. And that's why I keep always saying it's the system, like change the system, because there's so many factors involved that we can change the system and make it so it's good for everyone, but yet not have to change the individual themselves. Like, I don't care if I have racist cops. I don't. I care that they do racist actions. So if I have a non-racist cop like me who did racist actions like me, that's bad. But if I have a cop who's racist and treats every black guy with respect, I don't give a damn.
Let me just, I said I was going to finish, but I'll bring this up because I do think that it's not uncommon amongst, especially our younger activists, to feel like we have to address the bias, right? That it's not enough to make sure that the policy is implemented in a way that doesn't have disparate impacts, but that we have to address the bias. And I know, famously when Hillary Clinton early on in her campaign sort of was confronted by Black Lives Matters activists, this was one of her arguments, that I don't believe you change hearts and minds. I believe you change the policy. And it sounds like you feel similarly.
I don't think you have any other choice. It's not realistic to change minds. It's realistic to set up conditions where minds change themselves. And that's what I'm interested in. So if a cop goes through every single day and acting with empathy and going in, and if his supervisor is yelling at him because he didn't, properly give care to the victim's mother when she came to the crime scene, well, that changes things. And currently supervisors will just go, hey, make sure that person's out of here, or get her to the hospital. And they don't let them see the kids. So there's a lot of things that go on in that keep you from even being empathetic because of the system. Like, even if you are empathetic, the system and policies prevent you from acting that way. So she would be 100% right, but if I talk to Black Lives Matter like she does, I would be immediately dismissed like she was.
Fair enough. That's all the time we have for this episode of Nuance, after which I'm sure you've all dismissed us. Thank you very much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.
That was good. Good closing.